Okay. Hi. Welcome to Critical Thinking. We're still doing this. I've made everything, I feel like I've made everything a bit easier. Um, and I think it makes sense. I'm going to try to just stick to basics and not get too complicated about anything, because it's very difficult to suddenly shift to this completely different way of doing it. So if you've noticed, I haven't really been putting up quizzes like I said I would. But I am keeping up with these little class substitutions, where I do this instead of talking to you in real life. I'm glad people are following this. More people should, but then I can't tell them because they're not watching this right now. I always have this problem. But if you know someone who's in the class, remind them, please get in here. Check every day to see if there's something new. Like I just did those. I went over categorical logic. I did a bunch of exercises just so you could get some practice, but hardly anyone has checked it out. Maybe it's because I didn't require you to turn anything in for it. But still, it's part of the teaching process. It's something that I would do in class, and so since we can't have class, you really ought to be checking out all these videos. But of course, I'm again telling the wrong people, because here you are already watching this. So good job on you. Just tell your friends, tell your lazy friends. So we're gonna be done with categorical logic for now. Okay, you will be tested on it at some point, right? Certainly for the final, and maybe we'll revisit it a little bit before the final, just as a refresher. And I'm never going to give you anything too complicated or tricky, right? I just want you to be able to demonstrate that you can do some of this very basic deductive kind of thinking. And again, remember, I don't think that you'll use that kind of knowledge out in the real world. Fallacies, this is going to be a little bit different, okay? This is going to be very much applicable to your everyday situation, whereas I don't think in everyday life you're ever going to be drawing Venn diagrams. I don't see the point of doing those for that reason. I view them as pure exercise, or rather exercising pure reason, right? Where you're developing this part of your brain that doesn't often get isolated and practiced on and improved in that way in everyday life, right? So you're doing pure reasoning either through propositional logic or categorical logic. You're doing something that you don't often do, but you're bulking up that muscle in your brain of being able to do pure abstract thoughts. And so I think that is going to translate to real life changes if you really do that, right? Your brain structure will change as a result of learning this kind of stuff. It will, I think, make you a faster thinker and increase your ability to think abstractly and logically. So what I'm trying to say is I want you to be able to at least engage in some of that really well, even if it's with some simple examples, some simple Venn diagrams, but for you to be able to really see the way that validity works, so that you can see the conclusion showing up just by entering the premises. But today we are introducing the idea of fallacies. Right? The word fallacy is used in different ways. Sometimes people use the word fallacy to refer to any mistaken idea that is common. Right? So lots of people think that XYZ, whatever it may be, that's a fallacy, right? Just a mistaken idea about something. I should have thought of a good example. Here, I'm going to pause it so I can think of an example. Cats and dogs, the difference between cats and dogs, right? They've done some studies that show that, a lot of people think that cats are somehow a little bit more standoffish and are not quite as social as dogs are. Research shows that a lot of that is mistaken. So people say something like, well, it's a fallacy to think that cats are less warm and cuddly than dogs are, or something like that. A fallacy in that sense just means a mistaken idea that a lot of people think. That's not what we mean by fallacy here. For us, the focus is always on arguments, on reasoning, right? Where you're inferring something from a data set, whether those are premises or whatever, however you want to put it. You have some beginning information, and then you're extrapolating from that. That's how arguments work, right? Or you're backing up your claim with reasons. So we want to evaluate those. Fallacies, then, for us, is going to mean just repeated patterns of bad reasoning, patterns that we see happen a lot. Right? So they happen so much that we give them a name, right? Human beings are amazing because we can think rationally and because we can reason, but we often do it terribly as well, right? So there are these bad ways of reasoning that human beings fall into all the time, whether intentionally or unintentionally, but it happens so often that we've given them names. And you've already encountered at least two of these. Oops. Hope I have enough time. I guess I should plug in. Here, I'm going to pause it so I can plug in my computer. Okay, yeah, I'm back. So yeah, if you think back to earlier on in the semester when we were doing propositional logic, remember we had all these different argument forms. We had valid argument forms, and then there were two invalid argument forms. Do you remember them? No? Denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. This is a bad placement of my face right here. Denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent, right? So the first one is, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. This is an argument form that pops up a lot, and it's wrong, right? The other one is, if P then Q, Q, therefore P. Neither of those argument forms is valid. Right? Well, if you wanted, you could test that with propositional logic, of course. You could prove that those argument forms are not valid. And they happen quite a bit. And so, yeah, those are patterns of bad reasoning that we've recognized and named. Right? So it's kind of nice because now anytime someone offers you an argument that involves denying the antecedent, for example, anyone who says, well, if P, then Q, and look, no P, so no Q, you know that that's wrong. There might be a good argument to be made for their conclusion, but that argument on its own is not good, right? Because you know this ahead of time. So you can quickly spot bad argument forms if you already know them. Right? So it's good to know some of these patterns ahead of time, especially the really commonly used ones. It just makes it a lot easier to spot bad arguments or bad reasoning quickly, right? It's basically you've come prepared, right? You can look at the argument in question, the one that you're trying to evaluate, and if you are aware of, a nice list of fallacies, you might be able to very quickly recognize that the argument is fallacious. You can go overboard with this, which you should not do, right? It shouldn't be this thing where it's a fallacy itself that we're going to look at, where you oversimplify someone's argument and spot a fallacy when perhaps they didn't actually commit a fallacy. You were just really ready to see one. So you got to take it easy. Don't rush in, but at the very least, having an understanding of these repeated patterns of bad reasoning is going to make you more prepared. You should still evaluate very, very carefully. But in some cases, you'll just be able to see, well, that does not work because it's denying the antecedent or something like that. So those ones, because they have to do with formal logic, they're called formal fallacies, right? And it's because we can define them really well using things like P's and Q's and the language of propositional logic. It's all very formal, but we're not going to really be doing those. We're going to look at informal fallacies. And those are a little bit less difficult to define as well as something like this. But at the same time, these do happen a lot, and it's good for you to be able to recognize it. And not just recognize it in other people, by the way, also in yourself, right? That's another problem sometimes with fallacies, is people just want to use them to hit other people over the head with. But it's ultimately much more productive if you, for yourself, try to be aware of bad reasoning on your own part. That's going to be better in the long run. So try to apply these to your own forms of reasoning as well. So here, let's look at an example. Let's say Jose says to his friend, yesterday my philosophy professor presented an argument for the idea that we don't actually have free will. And you can imagine Jose actually provides the argument, tells their friend, maybe they're disturbed by it. Maybe they think, well, that's a pretty good argument. Oh, but it's kind of weird to think that I don't have free will. Okay. But then Alice responds and says, I wouldn't worry about it. I've had that teacher too, and she's a total weirdo. You see what's happening here? Alice is basically saying or implying that we can just dismiss that argument, whatever the argument was for free will. We can just say we don't have to take that seriously, and we don't have to take the conclusion seriously. We can just dismiss it all out of hand because guess what? The teacher is weird. You see how that's problematic? Alice is not addressing the actual argument that the professor gave. That's what you should be doing as a good critical thinker, right? If someone asserts some proposition, some conclusion, like we don't have free will, and they provide an argument, then you should be a good critical thinker and evaluate that argument, right? Remember the two ways in which you evaluate an argument? You have to see whether the premises actually support the conclusion, either deductively or inductively, and then you have to see if the premises are actually true or false. Alice didn't do any of those things. She dismissed the whole argument, not because there's something wrong with the argument, but rather because there's something wrong with the person giving the argument. Right? They're attacking the person. They're attacking the arguer rather than the argument. And that's called an ad hominem, from Latin, meaning to or against the person. Right? So you're finding fault with the person, and then by extension with their argument, as though by showing that the person has something wrong with them, that therefore this argument must also somehow be wrong, which just does not follow at all. It's an illogical thing to say or do. So when someone brings up some sort of irrelevant personal trait, and it's usually negative, right? It's usually something negative about the person, in order to dismiss a claim that's being made or an argument that's being presented, that's an ad hominem, right? That's when you're attacking the arguer rather than the argument. And that's often a sign that someone maybe understands that they're not in the best position, that they want to disagree with the person and their conclusion, but maybe they don't have a good argument at all. And so they have to resort basically to name calling. It's really a form of that, right? It's really just saying, well, I'm not going to really address the argument you gave because I'm afraid to do that. Instead, I'm just going to try to, smear your character or something like that. And then maybe people won't notice that I have not actually addressed the substance of your claims at all. I've just distracted everyone by talking about some sort of negative personal trait. This kind of stuff does work, unfortunately, right? People are very easily influenced by that sort of thing. It's kind of crazy how effective it is. And you'll see a lot of this stuff in politics, right? Absolutely. A lot of this is ad hominem. Yeah. Of course, sometimes someone's personal traits are relevant, right? So it's not that anytime you talk about a person's personal traits or character that it's automatically irrelevant. That's not the case. It's going to be contextual for you to figure out, well, does their personality or their character or something they've done in the past, does that have any bearing on their argument or on what they're saying? If it doesn't, then bringing it up would be an ad hominem. But in some cases, for example, if someone's in court, there's a defendant who's been accused of something and they are testifying, then the prosecutors may bring up the fact that this person has been very dishonest in the past. They've lied about lots of stuff in the past to get out of tight situations. If they can actually prove that, then that becomes relevant, right? If this person's not trustworthy, then we can't trust their testimony. So it's not as though personal traits are always going to be irrelevant, but it'll be obvious when they are relevant, right? And it should be pretty obvious when they're not, right? Just when someone's personal characteristics have nothing to do with the premises and the conclusion that's being provided, that has nothing to do with the argument. So again, you got to evaluate arguments. Most of the time, you don't need to evaluate the person. A person's personal traits usually have nothing to do with the correctness of what's being argued. Right? So avoid that. Avoid ad hominems and learn to recognize it when other people do it. Okay? But do be careful. For all of these, sometimes I already said this, but you can get a little too eager to spot them. So you got to be careful. You got to look at context. You got to look at the whole context. Look at it in a holistic kind of way. And don't use fallacies just to win arguments. Right? You want to use them in pursuit of truth, something a little bit more noble than just winning an argument. Right? Okay, here's another fallacy. So today we're only doing 3 fallacies, and then next time we'll go through a few more. I just want to do a few to get us started. Okay, so we'll imagine another conversation here. Okay, so Mona here says, I think having a universal basic income would be a great idea. Not only would it be great for the economy, it would also provide a safety net for so many underprivileged citizens. Okay, so Mona here has provided an argument, right? The conclusion here is that universal basic income would be a great idea. Then she provides reasons for it, why it's a great idea. Right? Well, it's good for the economy, and it would be a safety net for a lot of people. So I'm not saying it's a good argument or a bad argument or anything, but Mona has made a claim and has backed it up with some reasons. Okay? So Mona is good on that end. And everyone knows what a universal basic income is, right? This idea that part of taxes will be redistributed in such a way that everyone gets a basic monthly income. Not supposed to be a substitute for getting a job or something like that. But a lot of nations, especially in Europe, have done something like this. Okay. But now Ravi's who Mona's talking about. Ravi disagrees. And that's what he says. I don't agree at all. What does he not agree with? He doesn't agree with the conclusion. Right? Having a universal income would be a great idea. That's at least what he's supposed to be responding to, right? Because that's what the argument that Mona gave. Just that, just universal basic income, and here are the reasons. And Ravi says, I don't agree at all. Sounds like you just want to make this great nation into a fascistic communist regime. Have you seen how well that worked out elsewhere? You see the problem there? So Mona presented an argument. But Ravi, even though he said he disagreed with her, he disagreed with what she just said, he goes on to describe something that's different from her actual argument or conclusion. Right? He attacked the idea of making the U.S. into a fascistic communist regime, which is not something that Mona ever actually argued for. So Ravi misrepresented Mona's position. He misrepresented it in such a way that it's quite easy to just bash it, right? By bashing here, I mean something like refuting it or disagreeing with it. Or most people will agree that it's a bad idea to have a fascistic communist regime, right? And so if Ravi can sort of associate that with Mona's view, and then say, well, that's clearly wrong, then Ravi might feel like he won the argument, and other people might think that as well. But he only was able to do that by misrepresenting Mona's position. It's called the straw man fallacy. So that occurs anytime someone attacks not the actual position argued for, but a different position, one that is much easier to attack. It's much easier to disagree with the idea of turning the country into a communist regime. It's much easier to disagree with that than with the conclusion or the claim that we should have some kind of universal basic income. There are two different things. Now, you might have all sorts of reasons to think that, well, the universal basic income is kind of a socialist idea, so maybe we can associate this in some way with communism or something like that. How people connect these dots sometimes. But Ravi didn't even bother to really connect the dots, right? He just flat out misrepresented her position and attacked that. And then, then you get to declare yourself victorious when really you have not addressed the issue at hand or the claim that was actually made. But this is an easy way to try to feel like you won an argument, or to try to show other people that you won an argument. It's just like the last one, right? It's something very dishonest, but it works. It very, very often works, especially if the person is eloquent and can talk real good, right? Then it really helps as well. If they're confident, and then it's very easy to just slightly change what someone said and then slightly change it again, so that by the end of it just sounds crazy, and then it's easy to just dismiss the whole position when really you have not addressed the person's position at all. But people will think that you did, and they'll think that you won. Right, so avoid that, right? Yeah, the idea is it's much easier to attack a straw man than a real person, right? Like, let's say it's basically the equivalent of, okay, hey, we're gonna go have a fight, right? We're gonna meet you behind the cafeteria at 4, whatever, and you show up and you see me, and I've dressed up a dummy just like you, and I wail on the dummy and I knock it down. Say, I won. Right? Well, not really. Right? I attacked a straw man. I didn't attack the actual person. The same thing is going on here, metaphorically, right? By attacking a weaker position, right, or a more ridiculous position, and showing that that's wrong, that then you've shown that the person was wrong. Well, you didn't, right? But it tricks people into thinking that you did. Okay, one more, and then this will be done. There'll be a little exercise at the end, though. Okay. So San says, aliens definitely exist. I just know it. And Ronnie says, really? How do you know? And San says, well, can you prove that they don't exist? Huh? Yeah. You may have encountered this. I'm guessing you've encountered the previous two as well at some point. Right. So what happened there? Ronnie asked Sam to provide reasons for his claim that aliens exist. Right? She's asking for an argument, right? Remember, that's what an argument is. You make some sort of claim, and then you provide reasons for thinking that it's true. And that's what Ronnie is asking from Sam. What's your argument for this? You say you know it. You really know this? Well, how do you know? Well, did he provide an actual argument with premises? Or did he provide evidence of the existence of aliens? No. What he did is he sort of sneakily implied that his statement was justified, right? That he could just say aliens are real, just because you can't prove it false. You see that? So, to make this a little more clear and to show how you could argue like this in lots of different contexts, let's just use a variable to symbolize aliens exist. So San was basically arguing like this. Well, we don't know that A is false, so A is true. That's the implication there. Or at the very least, it's something like, we can't prove that A is false, so it's acceptable for me just to assert that A is true. Since you can't disprove it, then I don't really have to prove anything. I can simply say that it is true, and I would be justified in saying that, because we can't prove that it's false. It's called appeal to ignorance, this kind of fallacy. So whenever someone argues that they are right just because you can't prove them wrong, they are committing this fallacy, right? Now, if they have a bunch of positive arguments that are really good, and you can't prove them wrong, well, then they probably have a pretty good position. Right? But if someone says that they are right just because you can't prove them wrong, then it is a fallacy. You know, this is related to the idea of the burden of proof, right? With whom does the burden of proof lie? Is part of the problem here. Well, usually it's going to be someone who has made a claim, and that claim perhaps is controversial or not quite certain for most people. If you come out and make some sort of claim, then you ought to be able to provide evidence for it. If I say leprechauns exist, and you ask me, well, how do you know that? And I say, well, they've never been disproven. And it would be kind of true, right? Maybe leprechauns are just really good at hiding. But that's not a good argument for thinking that they exist. So simply because you can't prove the non-existence of something does not mean that it does exist. And simply because you can't prove the falsity of a statement does not therefore mean that the statement is true. It just doesn't tell us anything either way. You need an actual argument. You need to provide some actual reasons. You can't just appeal to ignorance. You can't just appeal to the fact that we don't know that it's false to say that therefore it's true. That's fallacious reasoning. It just does not follow. So to recap, a fallacy in this class means just something like an identifiable pattern of bad reasoning. The ad hominem fallacy is when you attack the arguer personally rather than evaluating their argument. Straw man fallacy, where you attack an argument or position that is easier to argue against than the actual argument or position in question. You're sort of switching targets in a way that's unfair. And the appeal to ignorance fallacy. Oh, I forgot to put up a definition for it. Well, we just had it, so sorry about that. So appeal to ignorance is just, well, you can't prove that S is false, so I'm justified in saying that it's true. Okay, so then all I want you to do below is I'll put it up as a discussion. It'll be the kind where you can't see other people's until you post. Just come up with an example for each of these, right? We have 3 fallacies. Come up with your own either real or made up example, right? I just made those ones up. You could do it too. Just find something that sort of follows that pattern, those patterns of bad reasoning. Right? So I'm actually asking you to come up with fallacies. It's kind of a weird thing to do, but you have to know the enemy, right? You have to know what's wrong. So you might have to spend a little bit of time actually doing that. So come up with 3 examples of those fallacies, right? 1 for each, I should say. So 3 total, right? So come up with 1 example for straw man, 1 example for ad hominem, 1 example for appeal to ignorance. Okay, I'll be back later with some more fallacies. Bye-bye.